Let's talk right now about what is going on in our schools, because I think we all know that if you're looking for a school for your kid, one of the first things you look at is the Ofsted inspection. But in recent years, being big question marks about those Ofsted inspections, because of course teachers don't really want to be inspected. Apparently it's all very stressful. It's not very accurate. And with the terrible, sad death, the suicide of a primary school head teacher, Ruth Perry, during her soon after an Ofsted inspection, which took her from a high rating to a very low rating. Big question marks have been raised about this issue. Now, the former head of Ofsted, Amanda Spillman, she was in office when this sad, tragic suicide took place. She said that Britain is becoming a dangerous place where it's impossible to have a difficult conversation. And she defended her actions after Ruth Perry's death. And she said there was often too much focus on being kind to adults working in public services rather than concern for those using those public services, such as children who are pupils in those schools. Well, let's talk about this right now with Steve Chalke. He's the founder of the OASIS Trust, which incorporates 52 different academies across England. Good afternoon to you, Steve.
Hi, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, I was quite horrified when the news emerged about the claims that Ruth Perry, a teacher, had taken her own life as a result of an Ofsted inspection. I was horrified that anyone would take their own life in those circumstances, obviously. But I was also horrified that the reaction seemed to be in the political and teaching world, oh, well, in that case, Ofsted inspections are a bad thing. We must change everything because of this woman's tragic death. I thought that was a complete overreaction and indeed the complete wrong reaction. We need Ofsted inspections, do we not? We need a body that comes in and says to schools and teachers and head teachers whether they're doing a good job or not doing a good job, because parents and pupils aren't in a position to make those judgments. So would you agree that we still need to have a body that comes in and inspects schools?
Absolutely. Every school needs regulation, doesn't it? Every school needs inspection. Every business needs inspection. We all need to be accountable. I guess there are accountability structures built into your job, Julia. Without...
Oh, God, I hope not.
Without accountability, we're all lost. The issue is the nature of that, isn't there? After Ruth Perry committed suicide, as you know, there was a great deal of hand-wringing about what had happened. And then the new inspector, chief inspector, Martin Oliver, was appointed. Amanda Spillman stepped down. It was the end of her term anyway. And Martin Oliver stepped up at the beginning of this new year. And the first thing Martin Oliver did is he said, we're going to pause Ofsted inspections and we're going to give all of our inspectors training in how to spot stress and how to spot tension. And I chuckled about that because the truth is we run actually 54 schools now. Any Ofsted inspection or inspection of any kind is stress inducing, isn't it? So
and it should be.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the point, that the whole thing induces stress and anxiety. What you've got to do, though, I think, is reform. Well, I've got a friend who was responsible for a regulator in this country. It was to do with nuclear power until very recently. And he said, we have to hold our power stations to account. We've got to hold them to account. If they get this wrong, we blow up half the country. Yeah. And then he said to me, therefore, we would never inspect in the way that Ofsted does. We come and we hold people to account, but we come with support as well. We're a team. The inspection team and the team working in any nuclear power station, we're a team together. We tell them what needs to change. They tell us what their issues are, what their starting place is, and we both go away with tasks to do.
Right, so it's more collaborative rather than someone standing in the corner of the classroom. I can still remember when I was at school and you'd have the inspector in, and we were just the teachers would beg us, for the love of God, behave in this one class when this inspector's in. But, you know, they'd be standing there or sitting there in the corner just watching, and they're probably not getting the most sort of accurate view of what's going on. But this thing, a collaborative approach would definitely be the case. But I mean, at the end of the day, there are an awful lot of parents who think their local school is really good. I know someone whose job it was to close down failing schools. and to get rid of all the teachers and the heads. And the parents would be out there with their placards saying, "Save our school." No idea that this is a rubbish school and their children are being horribly, horribly failed because they've got nothing to weigh it up against. So we do need people who come in independently. But surely any teacher or head teacher who thinks they're doing a good job shouldn't be that afraid, in the same way that if I've not revised for an exam, I'm going to be more stressed about it than if I think, no, I've done the work, I've done the revision, it's going to be stressful, but I can handle that stress. Surely good teachers, good head teachers are not terrified of an Ofsted inspection.
Well, I understand the point you're making, but I do think it's slightly more complicated than that, because the question is, what are the inspectors coming in to look for, and what are the starting places? So, for instance, I don't know if you know what parents will know what an EHCP is. It's an education health care plan. And so children who are on the autistic spectrum or have some other learning difference, they're neurodivergent, they can apply and they can get an EHCP to help them with their education. But they may not be, well, they won't be typical learners for their age. They may be behind for their age because so the Ofsted inspectors don't build that into their inspection. Now, what happens is some schools find ways of not having children with EHCPs in their cohort. So if you look at schools in a town, you might get a school that does very, very well at GCSEs. And on all the criteria it's marked on by Ofsted. But when you dig and say, so how many children do they have who are not typical learners in their school, you find they've got 1%.
Yeah, so of course they're doing better. I've also seen other schools, some schools which have got, they're doing really well in terms of, the children's learning and everything like that, but they haven't ticked all the boxes on an anti-bullying policy. So some of the paperwork isn't, and that's the stuff that, look, of course we don't want the school to have bullying. I've seen plenty of schools, spoken to parents over the years who've got a school that's got all the tick boxes done. It's absolutely fine, anti-bullying. But their kids being bullied and no one's doing anything about it. So much of this is down to someone being in the school for perhaps a few weeks and getting the feel of the school. I remember reading some Ofsted reports saying, this is the school where, the head teacher knows every child's name and you can see their interaction between the children and the teachers, that there is clearly sort of trust and kindness. And that goes a long way towards better learning, but it doesn't replace good learning.
Yeah, but it's part of good learning, isn't it? It's part of good learning for life. And what about the school down the road that's got 30% of children on EHCPs, as opposed to the school with 1% because they didn't let those kids in, and yet they're being judged by the same measure?
Here's the thing, though, Steve. An awful lot of us parents go out of our way, whether it's by people move to a catchment area of a good school, or they try and get their kids to get into a grammar school if that's available, or like me, bought my way out of the system, to basically go out of my way to make sure my kid isn't at school with those kids and with those learning difficulties, whatever they result from, so that their kid is not held back and their kid can learn. Does that make us all selfish?
I think in actual fact, society is about mixing with people who are not like you. And that's part of an education, which makes you a good and rounded person, doesn't it? Somebody who's able to contribute to society. And so, of course, we all want the best education for our children, but there's a big question that we could have about what is the best education. Is it just academic attainment, or is it something a little bit more fulfilling in life than that? It's really interesting, I'm sure you know this, that some of the highest suicide rates amongst young people in the country are where we have Russell Group universities, Oxford, Cambridge, etc. So we can put kids through a pressure cooker which doesn't equip them for wider life.
High achieving, No, I completely understand. Just finally, I just want to ask you, National Education Union might be balloting for whether or not they go back on strike. What impact will that have on you at your schools?
It will have a different impact in different parts of the country. So the NEU are stronger in the big cities than they are in other parts of the country. So some of our schools will be crippled if they go on strike. Some of them hardly affected, depending which union teachers belong to. But I do think that underneath it all, we ought to hear something else. It is that, as you know, there's there's a huge gap in the number of teachers we're recruiting nationally. There's a huge gap in the number of teachers specifically around sciences. There's a huge gap in retainment, and 40% of teachers leave the profession within 5 years. That should be a wake-up call to us about addressing this whole inspection thing differently, but inspection is needed.
Indeed. Really appreciate you joining us. Steve Chalke there, founder of the OASIS Trust. They've got 54 different schools, academies across England. Philip Ingram, you're still with me in the studio. What kind of school did you go to? What kind of school did your kids go to? How do you feel about inspections?
Well, I went to what was called a voluntary grammar school because it was Northern Ireland, so state funded, but
they've kept the grammar system.
It kept the grammar system where I was, so I was very lucky. Inspections are important. You need to be able to hold organisations to account and make sure there's common standards amongst the different organisations so that people are being looked after. But you have to understand what the purpose of an inspection is, and if it's to improve things, if it's to keep things working, kids. Work from a collaborative perspective. Don't work from a I'm marking you out of 10, and if you don't get above 5,
we should all be on the same side, and that same side is making sure kids get a great education. But I do think the children should be prioritised over the feelings of the teachers or the head teachers.
Very much so.
Let's